All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a real game changer, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene.
Oh, yeah, that one definitely shook things up.
For sure. I mean, just that title, The Selfish Gene. We've got some excerpts from that summary you shared. And right off the bat, I'm hooked on this question, what's it really mean to call a gene selfish?
It's a potent metaphor, no doubt about it, and one that stirred up a ton of controversy.
Right. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, at its core, the selfish gene is kind of asking us to flip our perspective on evolution, see it from the gene's point of view.
And that's where things get a little wild, huh?
It can definitely be a mind bender.
So instead of looking at like individual animals or plants struggling to survive, we're zooming in on their genes, almost like those genes are the stars of the show.
Exactly. Dawkins is arguing that natural selection, the engine of evolution, it's acting most powerfully at the level of genes, not the whole organism.
So are we just along for the ride then?
In a way, yeah. Think of it this way. If organisms are like cars, genes are the drivers steering evolution over generations.
Okay, I can kind of picture that. So are we getting to the selfish part here?
We are. See, the selfishness that Dawkins is talking about, it's not about like feelings or conscious decisions. It's more about this inherent drive in a gene to make copies of itself and spread those copies as far as possible.
So like a competition between genes.
Exactly. It's like an evolutionary race where the genes that are best at replicating themselves are the ones that win out in the end.
Makes sense. But then how does that explain all the different behaviors we see in nature? You know, animals cooperating, competing. Sometimes they even seem to be altruistic. How does that all fit in with this whole selfish gene idea?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Huh.
Let's take those black-headed gulls you mentioned earlier. There's been observations of them eating the chicks of their neighbors, which, well, from our point of view, seems pretty brutal.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Not exactly a warm and fuzzy image.
No, not at all. But if you think about it from the gene's perspective, things look a bit different.
How so?
Well, by taking out the competition, that gull is increasing the chances that its own offspring, and therefore its own genes, will survive and reproduce.
Oh, so it's like eliminating the rivals.
Exactly. Might seem cruel on the surface, but from a purely genetic standpoint, it's a ruthlessly effective strategy.
It's like there's this whole other layer of motivation we usually don't even think about.
Exactly. That's the kind of perspective shift the selfish gene is all about.
So if I'm seeing a bird acting all aggressive, maybe I'm actually seeing a gene's way of outsmarting the competition in this evolutionary game.
You got it. But then what about those seemingly selfless acts we see in nature? How can a gene that's all about self-preservation also lead to altruistic behavior?
That's a good question. Because those two things, selfishness and altruism, they seem completely opposed.
Right, they seem like they shouldn't go together.
Yeah.
But this is where Dawkins brings in this idea of kin altruism.
Kin altruism.
Yeah. It's this idea that genes can benefit by encouraging helping behavior, especially towards relatives.
Okay, but why would a gene push an organism to risk its own neck for someone else, even if they are related?
Well, remember, for genes, it's all about replication, right? And your relatives, especially the close ones, they're likely to share a lot of the same genes you do.
Right, makes sense.
So Dawkins came up with a way to measure this shared genetic inheritance, the coefficient of relatedness.
Okay, so the closer the relative, the higher this coefficient.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Identical twins, they have a coefficient of 1, meaning they share 100% of their genes.
Wow, okay.
Then you have parent and child, or siblings. They have a coefficient of 0.5, so they share 50%. And then you have cousins, a coefficient of 0.125, that's 12.5%.
So it's like genes are doing a cost-benefit analysis, right? Weighing the odds based on how much genetic material is at stake.
It's a powerful way to think about how evolution can shape behavior. Imagine a prairie dog risking its life to warn its colony about a predator. Seems selfless, right?
Yeah, heroic even.
But from the prairie dog's gene's point of view, it's actually a brilliant move. By sacrificing one individual, it might save dozens of relatives, and that means saving many copies of its own genes.
Wow. Yeah, when you put it that way, it makes a lot of sense.
Right. It challenges how we usually think about altruism.
It really does. It makes me wonder how much of what we see as altruism in nature is actually driven by these kinds of hidden genetic calculations.
It's a fascinating question to ponder, isn't it? And that's one of the big things the selfish gene does. It really shakes up how we understand evolution.
It definitely does. But what about cooperation between individuals who aren't related? Where does that fit in?
Ah, well, that's where game theory comes into play,
Huh.
specifically a scenario known as the prisoner's dilemma.
Prisoner's dilemma. Okay, now you've got me intrigued. How does that relate to genes and cooperation?
It's this classic thought experiment that helps explain how cooperation can actually evolve even between individuals who aren't related, might even be rivals.
Mm.
Imagine two suspects, right? They're arrested for a crime.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
They're separated, can't talk to each other, and each is offered a deal. If one rats out the other, they go free while their partner gets a long sentence.
Oof, that's rough.
Right. But if both stay silent, they both get a light sentence. And if both confess, they both get a medium sentence.
So, what's the best strategy if you're only thinking about yourself?
Well, in a single interaction, the most rational choice is to betray the other, hoping to get the best possible outcome for yourself.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tempting.
But here's the catch. When this game is played over and over again, something really interesting happens.
Over and over, like they might encounter each other again in the future.
Exactly. The prisoners start realizing that cooperating, staying silent, actually leads to better outcomes for both of them over the long haul.
So, even though they might want to betray each other at first, they learn that working together is actually better in the long run?
Exactly. It's like they build up this kind of trust, of reciprocal relationship, even though they're essentially rivals.
Wow, okay, so even though their instinct might be to betray, they realize that cooperating is actually the more selfish strategy over time.
Precisely. And that's the key insight Dawkins takes from the prisoner's dilemma. Even though genes are selfish at their core, they can benefit from strategies that promote cooperation, especially when there's a chance for future interaction and mutual benefit.
Okay, this is really making me rethink things. So even selfish genes can learn to play nice, huh?
In a way, yeah. They figure out that sometimes working together is the best way to win the evolutionary game.
It's amazing how the selfish gene connects these big evolutionary ideas to the things we experience every day.
It really does, and it's just the tip of the iceberg.
So are we really just puppets controlled by our genes? Where does free will and morality come in?
Ah, great question. And that's where we start getting into the really complex and fascinating stuff. It's something a lot of people wrestle with when they first encounter the selfish gene. It's important to remember that Dawkins isn't saying we're totally controlled by our genes. It's not like this genetic determinism thing.
So we're not just robots programmed to act a certain way.
Right, exactly. Think of it more like we have tendencies, predispositions. Genes give us a framework, a starting point, but they don't dictate every single choice we make.
Okay, that makes me feel a little less like a biological machine. But if our genes aren't calling all the shots, what else is shaping our behavior?
Dawkins argues that human culture plays a massive role. In fact, he introduces this really cool concept called memes.
Memes! Wait, like those funny pictures and videos that go viral online?
Well, it is a similar idea, but Dawkins was talking about memes way before the internet. He used the term to describe units of cultural information, ideas, behaviors, beliefs, trends, all that stuff that spread from person to person, kind of like replicating and evolving, just like genes do.
So it's like we've got this cultural evolution happening alongside biological evolution, and these memes are like the building blocks of that cultural evolution.
You got it. Think about language, fashion, music, religious beliefs, even scientific theories. These are all examples of memes that spread through societies, changing and adapting over time.
So some memes, like catchy songs or trendy clothes, they spread quickly and then disappear just as fast.
Exactly. But then others, like fundamental moral principles or those scientific laws, they stick around and end up shaping entire civilizations.
It's like there's this whole invisible world of memes battling it out for our attention, and influencing the choices we make. It makes you wonder how much of what we think and do is really our own original idea and how much is just these memes we've picked up along the way.
It's a pretty humbling thought, isn't it? It highlights how incredibly powerful culture is in shaping human behavior. But here's the really interesting part. Unlike with genes, we can actually choose which memes we embrace.
So we're not just passively absorbing these cultural memes, we can actually decide which ones we want to spread and which ones we want to resist.
Exactly. That's a key difference between genetic and cultural evolution. We can look at ideas critically, decide which ones resonate with us, and even come up with new memes of our own.
So in a way, we're not just shaped by Y evolution, but we're also shaping IT, both biologically and culturally. That's pretty empowering when you think about it.
Dawkins argues that this ability to make conscious choices is what sets humans apart from other animals. We can rebel against the tyranny of the replicators. He calls it both the genetic and cultural ones. We can choose which influences to resist, which values to uphold, and ultimately what kind of future we want to create.
I like that rebelling against the tyranny of the replicators. It makes me think of those moments when we go against our gut feelings or our habits or even what's considered normal in our culture. It's like those are the times we're really exercising our free will, right?
That's a great way to think about it. And it really underscores the fact that while the selfish gene is grounded in biology, it's not a deterministic view of human nature. It acknowledges how complex we are, the interplay of genes, culture, and individual choice.
Okay, I'm starting to see the nuances here, but all this does raise some tricky questions about morality, right? If our behavior is being pulled on by both these selfish genes and these cultural memes, how do we decide what's right and what's wrong? Can we really hold people accountable for their actions if their genes are kind of pushing them towards certain behaviors?
Those are some deep philosophical questions, ones that the selfish gene doesn't claim to answer definitively. But it does give us a new perspective on this age-old nature versus nurture debate. Free will versus determinism.
So it's not about picking sides, but more about recognizing how these different forces are interacting and influencing us.
Right on. We're biological beings shaped by evolution, but we're also conscious agents capable of making choices. And understanding this complex interplay, that's key to figuring out the ethical challenges we face, both as individuals and as a society.
Okay, I'm starting to wrap my head around this, but how does all this translate into our daily lives? What are some things our listeners can take away from the selfish gene and apply to their own experiences?
One big takeaway is that it encourages us to see the world through a different lens, the lens of the gene.
So, like, trying to understand what evolutionary advantage someone's behavior might be serving.
Yeah. It's not about excusing bad behavior, but more about trying to understand the deeper forces that might be driving it. And this can be super helpful in all sorts of situations, from personal relationships to understanding how society works, even global conflicts.
That's fascinating. It's like having a new set of glasses that let you see the hidden motivations behind people's actions.
Exactly. Another key takeaway is understanding how important it is to recognize how nature and nurture work together, those genes and that culture. The selfish gene reminds us that we're not just products of our genes, and we're not just blank slates shaped by our environment either. It's this dynamic interplay of both.
So it's not an either situation, but rather understanding that both our genes and our experiences play a part in shaping who we are.
Exactly. And recognizing that complexity is crucial for understanding ourselves and the world around us. It allows us to appreciate the diversity of human experience while also seeing the common threads that connect us all.
I'm starting to see how this book can change how we view everything from those everyday interactions to those bigger social things happening around us.
It can even give us insights into fields like politics and economics. Because at the end of the day, these are arenas where individuals with different motivations and strategies, shaped by both genes and culture, are competing and cooperating with each other.
It's like the selfish gene is giving us this framework for understanding how humans behave on every level, from the individual all the way up to the global scale.
It's a powerful framework, no doubt,
Yeah.
but it's important to remember that it's a model, a way of understanding the world, not some complete or definitive explanation for everything.
That makes sense. It's a tool for thinking, not a set of rules carved in stone.
Right. And like any tool, it's most effective when you use it thoughtfully and remember its limitations.
Okay, we've covered a lot of complex stuff today. Selfish genes as these replicators, kin selection, the prisoner's dilemma, cultural memes, and what all this means for understanding how humans behave and where morality comes in. So, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the selfish gene gives us a really profound and thought-provoking way to understand life and evolution. It challenges our assumptions, broadens our perspectives, and invites us to see the world in a new light.
It definitely makes you think differently about things. It's like peeling back a layer of reality to see the gears turning underneath.
Exactly. And even though it can be a bit unsettling to face some of these ideas, it's ultimately a really enriching experience.
It's like the selfish gene is laying down a challenge, asking us to grapple with these big questions about who we are, why we do what we do, and what it means to be human in a world shaped by both biology and culture.
And those are questions worth wrestling with. The more we understand ourselves and the world, the better equipped we are to handle the challenges and seize the opportunities life throws at us.
It's amazing how the selfish gene connects those big sweeping ideas about evolution to our everyday lives. It's like it's given me this whole new lens to look at the world through.
It's definitely a book that stays with you. It raises these questions that just keep bouncing around in your head long after you've finished it.
Totally. It really makes you think. So, we've been diving deep into this whole concept of genes as selfish replicators,
Yeah.
driving evolution behind the scenes. And we've talked about how that perspective can explain stuff like altruism towards family and even cooperation between rivals. But for me, one of the most mind blowing parts is how it makes us rethink human nature.
Yeah, it forces us to ask those big questions like, are we really in control of our actions, or are we just kind of playing out a script written by our genes? No easy answers there, but the selfish gene definitely gives us some tools to explore that complex territory.
It's like realizing we're part of this massive evolutionary story, one that stretches back billions of years. We're not just isolated individuals making choices on our own. It's like our behaviors, our motivations, even our values are shaped by this huge history of genetic and cultural inheritance.
It's a pretty humbling realization, isn't it, to see ourselves as products of this vast, interconnected web of life, shaped by forces way beyond our individual awareness.
It really is. It makes you feel connected to all living things in a way I hadn't really grasped before. But if we're all just vehicles for these selfish genes, does that mean real altruism is impossible?
That's the million-dollar question. It's one that has fueled a ton of debate. Some people say that even our most selfless acts are ultimately driven by this desire to spread our genes, either directly through our kids or indirectly by helping those who share our genes.
So even when we're being compassionate or empathetic, there's this underlying genetic motivation. That almost sounds kind of cynical, doesn't it?
I can see why you might think that, but I think it's more nuanced than that. The selfish gene isn't saying human kindness doesn't exist or that moral values aren't important. It's just offering a different perspective on where those things might come from.
So it's not about denying our capacity for good, but more about understanding where those behaviors, both the selfish and the selfless ones, come from. Those deeper evolutionary roots.
Exactly. And understanding that can actually give us more power to make conscious, ethical choices. If we recognize those innate tendencies we have, the ones shaped by evolution, we can be more aware of them and maybe even override them when we need to.
It's like if we know our biases, we can make better decisions.
Exactly. By understanding how our genes and our culture influence us, we can be more intentional about creating the kind of world we want, one that reflects our values and not just our biological programming.
That's a powerful message. It's like the selfish gene is both a challenge and a call to action. It makes us question our assumptions about human nature, but it also empowers us to overcome those limitations and strive for something bigger.
It's an invitation to actively participate in the story of evolution, not just stand by and watch it happen.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. The selfish gene offers such a humbling and empowering perspective. It reminds us that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves, but it also highlights how we have this unique ability to make choices. And with that ability comes the responsibility to use it wisely.
It's a book that really sticks with you, urging you to look at the world with fresh eyes and dig deeper into those big questions about yourself and where you fit in the grand scheme of things.
So if our listeners are left with just one thought after this deep dive, what would you want it to be?
I'd want them to remember that the selfish gene isn't some recipe for despair or cynicism. It's really an invitation to understand the forces that shape us, so we can be more conscious, more compassionate, and more deliberate in our actions. It's a call to embrace the full complexity of human nature, the good and the bad, and everything in between, and use that understanding to build a better future for ourselves and for all the generations that come after us.
Well said. And on that note, we've come to the end of our exploration of the selfish gene. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and left you feeling inspired to keep asking questions, to keep exploring, and to keep diving deeper into the mysteries of life. Thanks for joining us.